Welcome, friends, to this bonus content episode of the Music Ed Mentor podcast. In this short chat, I've once again brought in Scott Burstein, Director of Teaching and Learning for Little Kids Rock, and Director of the All-National Modern Band Honor Ensemble, the first one ever, to share with you the 5 hypotheses of language acquisition and how these concepts can be used to help improve your teaching, your learning, and your students' educations. Let's hop in.
So I guess we'll start with the learned versus acquired hypothesis, which is kind of the outset, simplest one, in your face, learned versus acquired. So basically, your first language, you don't learn, you acquire it. It wasn't like somebody sat you down in a room and said, all right, now that you're 6 months old, it's time to start talking about language. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to start on verbs. Let's make sure we can conjugate these verbs correctly. There's also different tenses for that's just not how we learned our first language. We didn't learn it. We acquired it. We listened a whole bunch, heard the world around us. We heard our parents talking to us, and we learned to start approximating language itself, right? And then we were scaffolding because we were communicating with a professional while we were doing it at a basic level. And the better we got, the more we acquired it. In the American public education institutions, we'll find that primarily people try to learn their second language. They sit in a language class. And I think that there are a lot of really, really sharp language classes in this country. But the majority of people don't ever learn their second language. We find that people are successful doing it out of necessity or because they work really, really hard studying it and find value in it, or they had teachers that use an acquisition model for learning a language. So the concept is the same with music. You don't learn music, or some people can, or they do, but ideally what you want to do is you want to acquire it through exposure and use. So for instance, if you're jamming with people, if you're just playing on, like if I go to, if I show up at a party and a bunch of people have instruments there and they're like, hey man, does anyone want to jam? We're going to do like an A blues. That means that somewhere you've learned enough to like kind of sub in. Maybe you only know 3 chords and people are shouting out to you when to play what. It's not like a learned system where you sat down and you had to study every little bit of aspect of it. You didn't understand the grammar of what you're doing, that maybe you just kind of picked it up through exposure and use. And so that's basically the first hypothesis, is trying to use acquisition rather than actual learning. So we can think about it in a lot of different ways. Like for instance, when we do our workshops, one of the first activities we do is we just put on a song and teach you a couple basic things they can use to jam with it and then let you explore and improvise, versus sitting down and saying, okay, this is a song. Everyone open up your book. We're going to turn to this page. Here's a staff. There's 5 lines. Here's a treble clef. Here's the notes. Here's how you would play. Like, it's just way more information that you would need to do. So that's the basics of learn versus acquire. Then we can start looking at, I think the second most tangible of the hypotheses is probably the effective filter. And what's the effective filter? It's this actual block that you have when you're trying to study something and you're trying to show that you can do something. If you're nervous, if you're scared, if you're upset, if you're angry, these are all things that can raise your effective filter, and it makes it so you can't produce. So for instance, if I'm in a music class and maybe I keep hearing the wrong note and I'm getting frustrated with my students, so I'm yelling at them and I'm like, come on, find the right note, find the right page, what's the fingering? They're going to struggle to do those things. This is very common in every kind of education in a testing situation. You may have thought about this yourself, where you were perfectly ready to do something really well and you felt like you were studied as well as you could be. And then you got to the test and all of a sudden with a higher pressure situation, you got nervous and you were no longer able to do as well. People that say they're bad test takers, this is very common. So the concept with effective filter is to use stuff to get rid of the effective filter. For us, we think about 3 specific things. We think about using something familiar, or for us, it would be student-centered, using student-centered repertoire that they're already familiar with. It'd be encouraging them. And for us, that's scaffolding, right? Like that kid that's having a discussion with their parent, they're encouraging them to do better, do more. Come on, here's how we're going to do this together, and simplifying it to make the task easier. And for us, that's approximating. So that's the basics of it, is making sure that someone feels like they can be successful, is encouraged to be successful, and is familiar with the task at hand.
So can we jump in, and could you explain to me how you see the term scaffolding?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I know when
Sure.
I was in my, pedagogy classes in college, it was, scaffolding is the idea that you're building on previously learned concepts, but it sounds like
Yeah.
you're using it in a little different way.
Well, I would say no. That's absolutely true. So if you think of scaffolding of a building, you have it held up. The way that we think of scaffolding in our classroom is just that yes, you're building on previously gotten content, but you're doing it at all different levels at the same time. So, for instance, you could have beginners, intermediate, and advanced people all working on different levels of the scaffold together. So, maybe you only know how to strum a couple chords, but somebody else knows how to take a killer solo, and someone else can play, the song note for note exactly the way the original was. You guys can all play at the same time. You're at different levels of the scaffold, right? Because there's some skills that you don't have yet, but you can still participate at the same time. You're really helping hold up the foundations. So a good example would be a classroom where you have 50 kids in it, and they're all playing modern band. And you've got a whole bunch of guitar players, a whole bunch of keyboard players, but then you have your two electric guitar players and one plugged in keyboard and a bass player and a drummer that form the core. They're like the top level. And they're going to sound great, but they're going to be supported by everybody else at the bottom there. All the students that maybe don't know nearly as much, but can still participate. They're playing with the professionals in the same way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks. Go on.
Sure. Let's go to the monitor hypothesis, which is probably the next one that I think is pretty tangible. I like to think of it when I think of my own Spanish speaking skills, which are minimal at best. And the reason why isn't because I haven't studied it that much. I mean, I took Spanish for over 4 years. The reason why is because I'm constantly second guessing what I'm saying. I have a monitor going on my brain, and that monitor is stopping me all the time and checking for correctness. So, for instance, when I'm speaking in English, I can mostly just riff and talk and improvise or whatever. However, when I'm in Spanish, I also have to stop and think, am I using the right tense of that verb? Am I conjugating it correctly? Do I have the words in the correct order? Am I using the proper gender for the noun? Is it a la or an L? Who knows? Is this table female or male? I have no idea. So those are all things that go through my brain whenever I'm trying to speak in Spanish, and it makes it really hard for me to do it. And raises my affective filter, of course. So the same thing happens in music, right? Where I feel very good as a guitar player, and I can solo over a lot of stuff. I've been improvising for a long time. If we're jamming, you can do that. But if someone's like, hey, we're going to take a solo over giant steps or some crazy jazz standard with changes all over, all of a sudden my monitor kicks in. It's going to be like, wait a minute, that 5/7 chord, it's an alt chord. Are you hitting the sharp 5 and the flat 5 and the sharp 9? Which scale should you be using here? You can use that melodic minor scale up a half. There's all these different things. My brain knows what notes to do, but it's stopping me to make sure I'm doing it correctly rather than just exploring and experimenting. So my monitor kicks in right there. That wasn't how I learned how to solo originally, when it was like just playing over the blues, where they're like, here's a couple of notes. Play these couple of notes. See how cool they sound? Keep messing with them. Awesome. And so I think that's a thing. The goal with the monitor is to shut it out. And the best way to shut out the monitor, similar to the affective filter, is keep it simple, have less choices, make sure there are no wrong notes, there's no judgment, so you're comfortable and you're happy with what you're doing. So that's the monitor hypothesis. And then the last two hypotheses kind of tie in together, the input plus one and the natural order. And it seems like at the outset they kind of contradict each other, but they really don't. So the input plus one basically states that you can do what you can do, and you can do one more thing to have comprehensible input. In other words, like if I can add, I'm ready to learn how to subtract, but I can't go to long division. That's too many steps through the input plus one. That's like input plus 3, right? Because you need to know how to subtract before you can divide. And maybe multiplication would help. So there's all these different things you need to know in between to be successful. So a good example can be, for instance, on a scale when I'm learning to solo. Maybe I start off with 2 notes. Oh, I really killed it with these 2 notes. Maybe I'll move to 4 notes. But if you're like, okay, cool, you're killing it with 2 notes. Here's a full scale, and you can only use it over every other chord, and then you have to move it over 3 half steps to make it for the next chord. Like, that's just way too much to think about. It's too high of an input jump. So comprehensible input only occurs. We only learn new things when it's just one level above what our current knowledge is. So that's a really important point, and hopefully you see how that ties in with everything else. Now, that would seem to lead somebody to believe that it means that our input, like the stuff that we're learning, should happen in natural prescribed order. Now we get to the natural order hypothesis, which it seems like, oh, cool, we should definitely have a natural order. So it seems like most of us feel like there is a natural order for things, and you should learn in that natural order. But based on the concept of second language acquisition, it would appear that's actually not true. Even though it makes sense, we often learn better when we're not learning in a prescribed natural order. When we learn things when we're ready and appropriate, but we'll pick up lots of other things. So these all kind of tie in. That means, like, you know, in other words, to learn a solo, I don't need to be able to tell you the name of every chord I'm soloing over. I don't need to be able to, you know all the notes of the scale I'm playing and what they're called, or understand them on a staff, or see the grammar for it. Basically, what I need to do instead is just kind of, I can experiment and I can learn other ways, and the natural order will eventually kind of fit itself back in there. So if you tie those all together, you basically have the basis of the difference in how we believe working in music can be more appropriate for most learners. I mean, there's definitely successful musicians learning in lots of different ways out there in this world. There's lots of people bucking these trends of what I talked about. I mean, I think I'm one of them in some ways, for sure. However, I can also think about it in terms of the ways that it's worked differently for me. I always think back to my own experience in Spanish, because as someone that grew up in the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world, city in the world, which is Los Angeles, just behind Mexico City. It's amazing to me that I never really picked it up more. And the reason why is because I can think back. My first semester Spanish course I took was a very, very intensive, okay, we're going to count to 100. Uno, dos, tres. Okay, now here's a verb. It's jugar. Let's conjugate it. Yo jugo, tú juegues. And it was just so much like that. And then I went to a new school in my second semester, and I ended up in a language acquisition model. I walked in, and the professor was like, "Oh, ¿cómo se llama?" And I was like, "Wait, what? Oh, you're asking me my name? Oh, yeah, my name's Scott." And I said it like that. And she's like, "No entiendo. ¿Cómo se llama?" And I just had no idea what she was doing. And literally in that class, they didn't speak one word of English. This was, 10 weeks into Spanish. No English was allowed in the class whatsoever. I failed. It's the only class in my life I failed. I had a tutor. I was a good student. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't figure it out because I was so acclimated to what I'd done before, and I'd learned so little. I was so far behind. So, but once again, then later on, the more I travel, the more I do stuff in Spanish-speaking countries. As I'm there, and I just force myself to talk, and I think less about it, the more I can speak that way. So I think that this kind of happens in our workshops a lot. I mean, you've now been there and you've experienced one. And there's probably a lot of moments that maybe you had where you're like, wait a minute, you mean I can just do this instead of thinking it through? And I don't know, Lisa, like your level of comfort, but I know that you play the horn in ensembles, and I'm assuming that when you do, you have sheet music in front of you. So
yes, let's go with yes.
So, like, I would assume that, like, for you, potentially, like, if I said, hey, man, we're going to have a jam, we're going to take a solo, it's going to be an F sharp minor, grab your horn, you ready to solo with me? How would you feel about that?
I would feel very uncomfortable.
Right? And I think that's a thing with a lot of music teachers. There's many, many moments of the acquisition model for learning music that they're uncomfortable with because they can't experience it and they learned a different way. A lot of time, ORF teachers particularly meld well with us because they're kind of used to that model. But so it's great and it's interesting and it's new. And I'm hoping that people, the biggest thing isn't just understanding it. If you hear it, then you're really not actually doing the pedagogy itself because the pedagogy is all about doing it. So now that you've been to a workshop, the thing is like, what do you do next? Do you sit around, do you start jamming more? Do you start putting on recordings of your favorite artists and start trying to take solos over it or learn the melody and modify it and experiment with it? And that's really the goal. That's where it comes. You get people together and start jamming because that's the way to make it work,
Well, honestly, there was a couple of years ago that I was with some friends and everybody had their instruments and mine stayed in the car because they were all comfortable just sitting there jamming together. And I, the one person in the room with an actual music degree, did not feel comfortable pulling out my guitar and playing along with all of them. It felt kind of ridiculous to me. But the thing I learned in the workshop, which, as you said, I have now attended my, Little Kids Rock 101, is you make it so easy to be successful at such a beginning level. And that's the thing that I really, really appreciated about it, because now I feel like I totally can jam. I mean, by the end of the workshop, I was, jamming on an instrument I had literally never picked up before that day with people that I barely knew who also were on instruments that they had barely picked up that day. And we all somehow were successful. And putting that opportunity in front of students to be successful at such an early stage is absolutely huge.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I really do appreciate that. I think it's really true what you say. And it's like, there's so many takeaways with what you just said. Like, so first of all, it's like a lot of people come and, I have all these people that are like, oh, I bought a bass after being at your workshop. I'm a bass player now. I joined a band. That's happened to me so many times. My inbox is full of people sending me pictures with their new bass. They play other instruments, but they don't want to play those instruments in this new setting and this new thing. And it's because they have that block where they're like, no, that's something different than this. And that totally makes sense. And I think now putting it into the perspective of a kid that maybe doesn't have any musical experience whatsoever, it's a game changer when you don't have this other learned experience to deal with. But you know what I really, like just one last anecdote, which I may have said before, but I don't think I did. But this one ties it in for me, and it really ties to what you just said specifically. So when I was young, I started out playing guitar more or less. I had some piano that I failed at when I was 5. And it sucks feeling like you're a musical failure at 6 years old because you didn't survive piano lessons. But then I started playing the guitar and I got good at it. And then I got real good at it. And then I started playing in other bands at school. And so one of my best friends, we didn't really have a jazz band at my school. We actually started one while I was there, or we restarted one that had been defunct for 15 years at the school I went to. And me and my best friend at the time, we got a gig playing music. I played upright bass, he played guitar, and we did jazz standards, for 2 years. And dude, it was awesome. And then when we would decide we were going to go to college, I decided to be a music major. He wanted to be a music major, but he switched. He just didn't like it. And by the way, he'd been a classical piano player since 5. Like, I auditioned on this simple little Bach prelude on classical guitar and got in. And he played a Bach prelude and fugue and a Debussy prelude and a Beethoven sonata. And, a lot of schools were like, that's all right. We're not really interested. And so he was kind of frustrated with the scene. But so anyways, fast forward, he passed away a couple years ago, suddenly. And so a bunch of his friends were at his memorial service. And one of them was someone that he knew from college, and he went to Berkeley. And if you know anything about Berkeley, there's a whole bunch of it's very hippie. So of course he went to Berkeley. Of course they all listened to the Grateful Dead and other jam bands. And of course they all lived in a house with 20 people together. I mean, there's maybe 7 of them in this house. But so in his sophomore year, he was living with 7 people in this house. There was one music major. It wasn't him. Now, this music major was talking about this at his funeral, and she basically says, or his memorial, and she basically said, I've been playing classical piano my whole life. I was a classical piano major. I could do all sorts of stuff. I was in my sophomore year. I moved in this house with a bunch of people. None of them were music majors, but they all played music. And they would get together almost every night and kick it and play some Dead songs and jam. And I didn't know what to do. I felt uncomfortable. And finally, they convinced me. They showed me how to jam with them. And it was the first time in my life I had ever played music with other people. And that was such a weird, powerful thing for me to think about. You've gone that long in your life. You're now 20 years old. You've been playing for 15 years. And because you're a piano player, you've never once played with someone else. She literally thought her life was supposed to be sitting in a practice room, practicing notes on a page, and then performing it for audiences. And she's like, it changed my life. It revolutionized everything. And I think that's really kind of the key of what we're trying to go for. And it might rub some people the wrong way. But once again, I don't particularly care how many music majors we have in the world. I was a music major. I loved it. It enriched my life, made me a better person. I love music teachers. But do we need more music majors? I don't know. What I want is more music players. I want more music makers. I want people that are excited to make music. that feel like they could get together with other people and just pull out an instrument and jam or just sing or whatever and really have their life enriched that way. And I think that what we're hoping is people that go through this experience of this MSL, music as a second language, will feel that way.
Awesome. Do you want to tag on a little blurb about what we should look forward to coming from Little Kids Rock?
Oh, well, we have a couple of things we can look forward to. I mean, so first of all, on July 29th through August 1st, we have our Modern Band Summit, which is the Little Kids Rocks conference that happens in Fort Collins, Colorado. And there's going to be tons of music making and stuff going on there. So that's really exciting. We also have a method book series that's going to be hopefully published within the next 6 to 12 months on teaching modern band in the classroom. I think it's going to be called the Modern Band Method or Method for Modern Band, which will literally be like a series where, you as a teacher would have one, guitarist would have a different book, keyboardist would have a different book, but you can all play together. You can work on improvisation and composition, which I think, you and I talked a little bit about, like, kind of like, you've been to an 8-hour Little Kids Rock workshop. Now what? And it's like, this is cool. And I'm also overwhelmed and don't know where to start. And, part of it has always been like, we don't really care where you start or what you do. We just want you to be cool with the pedagogy. But this method book will hopefully be more laid out and help people at least have an idea for pacing and just the way that we think. Because I think that is the constant question. It's like, now that I understand all this, I still don't have the skills. I have a lifetime of training to do something else, and now I'm supposed to do this. Help,
Yeah, don't throw us into the deep end of the pool. Give us the shallows. All right. Well, you've spent your time. Thanks for recording this little bonus episode for me. And hopefully a lot of people will grab it and appreciate it as much as I do.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. And looking forward to being on your International Music Ed Summit coming up soon.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome.
All right. Talk to you later.
I hope you enjoyed this little bit of bonus content. Remember to get all the additional bonus links and information by going to smartmusic.com/blog and searching for episode 46. Until next time, keep teaching on.